September 17, 1945, 3:47 in the afternoon. Walker Ranch, 40 miles northwest of San Antonio, Texas. The boots on the wooden porch stopped mid-step. A military truck had pulled up to the gate, its wheels churning red dust into the afternoon heat. The tailgate dropped with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty pastures, across the silent cattle, across the vast Texas sky that stretched endless and indifferent above them all. And from inside the canvas-covered bed, a figure emerged. She was 15 years old. She weighed 68 pounds. Her uniform, what remained of it, hung from her frame like rags draped over a wire fence. Her cheekbones jutted sharp enough to cut paper. Her eyes, sunken deep into dark sockets, stared straight ahead at nothing and everything. There was no fear in those eyes, no defiance, only absence, only the hollow gaze of someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world a long time ago. One of the cowboys took off his hat. Another muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. A third turned away entirely, his jaw working like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. They had been told these prisoners were dangerous, fanatical, trained to kill with their bare hands. The briefings had painted pictures of wild-eyed zealots who would rather die than surrender, who would slit your throat in your sleep, who had no regard for human life. But there were no fanatics here, no killers, only a girl, half-starved, barely breathing, stepping into a world she had been taught would devour her. What happened over the next 8 weeks would challenge everything these men believed about enemies, about mercy, and about what it truly means to be human. This is that story. The truck had carried 12 of them across the ocean, across the continent, to this forgotten corner of Texas where the horizon shimmered with heat and the only sounds were cattle lowing and wind whispering through dry grass. Walker Ranch, 2,000 acres of Texas dirt cattle and horses. Since 1944, the government had requisitioned a portion of the property to house prisoners of war. Not a camp in the traditional sense. No guard towers, no barbed wire fences stretching toward the sky. Just endless pastures, scattered buildings, and the unforgiving desert that surrounded everything like a natural prison wall. Where would they run, after all? There was nowhere to go. The 12 women descended from the truck one by one. They moved like ghosts, slow, cautious, eyes fixed on the ground. Their uniforms were torn and faded, the fabric hanging loose on frames that had known too much hunger for too long. Many of them were barefoot. Their shoes had been lost somewhere between Nagasaki and San Francisco, casualties of a journey that had taken weeks and felt like years. They had been taught to be silent, taught that any sound could bring punishment. They did not move until ordered, and even then it was with the hesitancy of animals uncertain whether the cage door had really opened or if this was simply another trap. The last to descend was the smallest of them all. Yuki Tanaka stepped down on bare feet. Her shoes had vanished somewhere on the ship, stolen or simply lost in the chaos of transport. Her feet touched the hot Texas dirt like they did not belong to her, like they were someone else's feet carrying someone else's body through someone else's nightmare. Her eyes scanned the horizon. No barbed wire, no machine gun nests, only cattle grazing in distant fields, horses swishing their tails against flies, hay bales stacked like sleeping giants, and a handful of American cowboys with rifles slung over their shoulders like afterthoughts, watching the women disembark with expressions that ranged from curiosity to confusion, to something that might have been pity. The sun was brutal. The air smelled of sweat, leather, and manure. For a long moment, nothing moved. Frank Peterson was the first to break the silence. He was 58 years old, the ranch manager, a man whose face had been carved by decades of Texas sun and Texas wind into something resembling weathered leather. He had fought in the Great War, had seen things in the trenches of France that still visited him in his dreams. He thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. He let out a breath through his nose and whispered, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe, just to God, just to whoever might be listening. Hell, she's just a kid. Another cowboy, younger, with tobacco-stained lips and calloused hands, spat into the dirt and looked away. She can't be more than 12. But there was one man who did not speak. One man who stood apart from the others, his hand gripping the reins of his horse so tight that his knuckles had gone white. Billy Walker, 23 years old, lean and hard, with eyes that held something cold and sharp like steel waiting to be drawn. He had volunteered for this assignment, not because he wanted to help, not because he believed in rehabilitation or mercy or any of those pretty words that politicians used. He had volunteered because his brother Jake had died at Pearl Harbor, and these were the people who killed him. The medical examination took place in a barn that had been converted into a makeshift infirmary. A single cot, a scale, a battered steel table holding gauze iodine and a pair of reading glasses resting on an open logbook. Dr. Samuel Henderson had been an Army medic since 1942. He was 38 years old with sunburned ears and steady hands that had stitched wounds, extracted shrapnel, and held the hands of dying boys as they called for their mothers. He had seen every kind of horror that war could produce. Or so he thought. When he placed Yuki Tanaka on the scale, he had to look at the number twice. 68 pounds. He blinked, adjusted the weights, looked again. 68 pounds. A girl her age should weigh at least 100. 110 would be healthy, 120 would be normal. 68 pounds was not a weight, it was a death sentence walking around in human form. He worked in silence, his pen scratching across the logbook as he recorded what he saw. Her ribs were visible through the thin fabric of her uniform, like the slats of a broken shutter. Her arms were so thin that when he wrapped his fingers around her wrist to check her pulse, they overlapped completely. Her abdomen was sunken inward. Her legs trembled just from sitting still. There were bruises too, old ones, healed in strange shapes that suggested beatings, suggested abuse, suggested a story he did not want to know but could not ignore. He offered her a cup of water. She did not move, did not reach for it, did not even look at it. He brought the cup to her lips and she drank, slowly, carefully, like she was tasting something forbidden, like she expected someone to snatch it away at any moment. Her face did not change. Not a flinch, not an expression, just mechanical swallowing. Eyes still staring straight ahead, unblinking, empty. Frank Peterson stood in the doorway watching. His hat was in his hands, held like a flag lowered in mourning. "What's the verdict, Doc?" Henderson sighed, setting down his pen. "She weighs 68 pounds, Frank. 68. I've seen calves come out of winter in better shape. Will she make it? If we feed her right and she doesn't have any internal damage we can't see, maybe, but Frank, I've been a doctor for 15 years. I've never seen malnutrition this severe in someone still walking." Frank said nothing. There was nothing to say. Henderson wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. It dwarfed her, swallowed her whole, made her look even smaller than she already was. She did not resist. She did not react. She just sat there like a bird with broken wings, waiting for whatever came next. "The question isn't whether she'll eat," Henderson said quietly, more to himself than to Frank. "The question is whether her body remembers how to live. To understand the girl sitting in that Texas barn, we need to go back across the ocean, back to a city called Nagoya, back to the days when the sky turned orange and the air always smelled of burning paper." Yuki Tanaka grew up in a small wooden house on the edge of the city. The roof was patched with tarps. The windows were covered with newspaper. It was not much, but it was home. Her father, Hiroshi Tanaka, was a fisherman. He had hands that smelled of salt and nets and a laugh that could fill a room. He used to carry Yuki on his shoulders when she was small, pointing at the boats in the harbor, telling her stories about the sea. He died in 1943. His transport ship was torpedoed by an American submarine somewhere in the Philippine Sea. They never found his body. There was nothing to bury, nothing to mourn over, just an empty space at the dinner table and a silence that grew larger with each passing day. Her mother, Sachiko, began boiling weeds for dinner. She called it wild vegetable soup, but Yuki knew the truth. It was what remained when there was nothing left to eat. Her brother Kenji was 17 when he joined the army in the spring of 1945. Yuki remembered the last time she saw him. He stood at the door in his new uniform, back straight, eyes fixed on some distant point she could not see. "Take care of Mother," he said. Then he walked out and did not look back. She never learned where he died, or if he died at all. The letters simply stopped coming, and eventually her mother stopped asking. At 13, Yuki was volunteered to become a Taishantai, a military auxiliary. The recruitment posters showed smiling girls serving the emperor with pride and honor. The reality was different. She scrubbed floors stained with blood. She folded sheets soaked with fluids she tried not to identify. She carried buckets of water too heavy for her bones through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and death. In the field hospital, she watched boys no older than Kenji bleed out in silence. The nurses, their eyes hollow and their hands never still, whispered the same phrase to every girl who cried. "Gaiman, endure, endure for the emperor." Yuki stopped crying months before she arrived in Texas. There was simply nothing left to cry with. The military instructors handed out ration cubes and propaganda pamphlets in equal measure. They taught the girls how to die with dignity. They never taught them how to survive. Surrender, they said, was worse than death. The posters were everywhere. Yuki could still see them when she closed her eyes. American soldiers with demon faces, horns growing from their heads, fangs dripping blood. The text beneath them burned into her memory like a brand. Americans eat human flesh. They will cook you and eat you. Another poster showed a Japanese woman on her knees, hands bound American soldiers standing behind her with evil grins. If you are captured, you will be violated. Your honor will be stripped away. Your soul will be crushed. A third poster depicted an American doctor with a scalpel standing over a bloody operating table. American doctors use prisoners for experiments. They will cut you open while you are still alive. One officer gathered the girls and spoke to them, his eyes flat and cold like the surface of a dead lake. You will be used, he said. They will strip your honor, your clothes, your soul. It is better to bite off your own tongue than to be taken alive. Yuki had nodded. She had believed. At the time, she believed every word. On the ship to America, she kept a sharpened stone hidden in her sleeve. If the Americans tried to touch her, she would slit her own throat. She had practiced the motion in her mind 1,000 times. Quick, clean, final. But when she stepped off the truck in Texas, she smelled hay instead of blood. She heard a banjo playing somewhere in the distance instead of screams. And the men who watched her did not leer or grab. They just stared. One of them took off his hat like he was at a funeral. She did not understand. None of it made sense. She was still waiting for the horror to begin. But Yuki was not the only one carrying ghosts. To understand the cowboy standing outside that barn with cold eyes and clenched fists, we need to go back to another Sunday morning, 4 years earlier, half a world away. Billy Walker was 19 years old when he heard the news. He was mending a fence on the north pasture, sweat dripping down his back, despite the December chill, when his father's truck came barreling down the dirt road. Dust flying, horn blaring. Something was wrong. His father, Robert Walker, jumped out of the truck with a face Billy had never seen before. White as paper, like someone had drained all the blood from his body. "Jake," he said. Just one word, but the way he said it, like the word tasted of ash and broken glass, Billy knew. Jake Walker was Billy's older brother, 22 years old, the golden boy of the family, smart, funny, the one who was going to make something of himself, the one who was going to put Walker Ranch on the map. Jake had joined the Navy because he wanted to see the world beyond Texas. He had been stationed on the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. He wrote letters home about Hawaii, about the sun and the blue water, and the friends he had made. "You'll come visit me," Jake had told Billy the Christmas before, grinning that easy grin of his. "When you're old enough, I'll show you the island. You'll love it, Billy. The water's so blue it doesn't look real." Billy never made it to Hawaii. Jake never made it home. He had been below deck when the bombs hit, probably asleep in his bunk, probably dreaming of Texas, of the ranch, of the life he would live when the war was over. He never had a chance to fight back, never had a chance to say goodbye. The USS Arizona went down in 9 minutes. 1,177 men trapped inside. Jake Walker was one of them. They never found his body. There was nothing to bury, just a folded flag and a letter from the Navy expressing condolences that meant nothing, that changed nothing, that could not bring back the brother Billy had worshipped since he was old enough to walk. His mother, Margaret Walker, never recovered. She stopped speaking for 3 months, stopped eating in any meaningful way. She would sit on the porch every day staring at the horizon, waiting for a truck that would never come, carrying a son who would never return. She died in the spring of 1943. The doctor said pneumonia, but Billy knew the truth. Her heart had shattered the same day the Arizona went down. She died of grief because the Japanese had killed her son, and she could not live with that. Billy had wanted to enlist, wanted to go to the Pacific, wanted to kill Japanese soldiers with his own hands to make them pay for Jake, for his mother, for everything. But his father needed him on the ranch, and his flat feet kept him out of combat anyway. So he stayed, mending fences, branding cattle, watching other men his age go off to fight and die in the Pacific while he stayed behind, useless, burning, with a hatred that had nowhere to go. When the Army asked if Walker Ranch could house a small group of Japanese prisoners of war, women, mostly nurses and auxiliaries, Billy had volunteered to be a guard. Not out of duty, out of hatred. He stood outside the barn that first night, watching through a gap in the door. His jaw was tight. His hands were fists at his sides. Inside, the girl who weighed 68 pounds was being wrapped in a blanket, was being offered water, was being treated with kindness she did not deserve. They killed Jake, he thought. They killed my mother and were giving them blankets. He did not understand. He did not want to understand. He wanted them to suffer. The way Jake had suffered, the way his mother had suffered, the way he suffered every single day waking up in a world where his brother no longer existed. But as he watched this girl drink water like it was holy, like it was the first clean thing she had tasted in months, a thought crept in, uninvited. She is the same age Jake was when he taught me to ride a horse. He pushed the thought away, buried it deep. But it was there now, and it would not stay buried forever. The barn had been cleaned and converted into living quarters. Not prison cells, no iron bars, just horse stalls swept out and filled with hay wool blankets folded neatly on top. Yuki was led to the far corner. She walked slowly, each step tentative, testing the floor like it might be a trap. She lowered herself onto the hay, expecting it to scratch, to bite, to punish. But it did not. It was soft, warm even. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders like armor. The fibers brushed against her skin, and she flinched. Not because it hurt, because it did not hurt. It was the first thing to touch her gently in months, maybe years. She lay back and stared up at the rafters. Listened. No boots stomping, no shouted orders, no sobbing. Just the soft crackle of firewood and the muffled grunt of animals settling in for the night. The smells were strange. Dust, leather, smoke. Not the familiar stench of disinfectant and rotting bandages. Not the acrid breath of bombed-out cities. It was cleaner, earthier. It confused her. Her body was tense, rigid beneath the blanket, as if it would be snatched away at any moment. She did not sleep. She did not know how to sleep anymore. Sometime around midnight, the barn door creaked. Yuki bolted upright, heart pounding. Her hand reached instinctively toward her sleeve, toward where the sharpened stone had been before they took it. A man entered. Frank Peterson, the old ranch manager with the red bandana around his neck and a tin cup in his hand. He did not approach quickly. Instead, he crouched by the wood stove, stirred something in a pot. A smell rose up. Meat, onions, something rich and warm. He ladled it into the cup. Steam curled upward in the dim light. He walked toward her slowly, not making eye contact, and held the cup out. "Stew," he said softly, just one word. Yuki stared at the cup like it was a bomb about to explode. In her mind, the propaganda screamed. Food from the enemy meant poison, meant shame, meant they were softening her before they did whatever they were going to do. But the smell, God, the smell. Brown broth, rich with fat, chunks of potato floating alongside shreds of beef, grease glistening on the surface like drops of gold. The smell punched through her defenses like nothing else could. Onion, beef, broth, fat, salt. Her stomach clenched, not with nausea, with a sudden wild hunger she could not control. When was the last time she had smelled something like this for the war? For her father died, she could not remember. Frank placed the cup on the floor beside her and backed away. Nodded once, then returned to the fire and sat down, beginning to whittle a piece of wood. He did not watch her, did not wait, did not pressure. He was just there, like she was not the enemy, like she was just a girl. Yuki stared at the cup as though it might vanish. Slowly, carefully, like diffusing a bomb, she picked it up. The metal was warm in her palms. She brought it to her lips, pausing just before the broth touched her mouth. If this is poison, at least I will die with a full stomach. She drank. The heat hit her tongue like fire. Salt, oil, something sweet, something bitter. Her body jerked in surprise. She nearly dropped the cup, but she did not drop it. She took another sip, and another, and another. Her eyes stung, not from spice, from something deeper, something old and buried. She was not just tasting food, she was tasting memory. Rice balls in summer, her mother's miso soup before the rationing began. The last time her stomach had known anything other than emptiness. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Frank said nothing. He just sat near the fire, whittling his piece of wood. His presence was quiet, not threatening, not even curious, just there. Like she was not an enemy, like she was a person. Back home, being seen was a danger. Being weak was a curse. But here in a barn that smelled of hay and soup, someone had handed her food and walked away. Not to watch her, not to interrogate her, just to feed her. And that, more than the stew, more than the blanket, shook her to her core. She set the empty cup down and curled under the blanket. Her fingers clutched the edged knuckles white. Somewhere deep in her chest, something small shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the first fragile crack in the armor she had been told to wear until death. Outside the barn, Billy Walker stood in the darkness, watching through the gap in the door. He had seen everything: the old man, the stew, the girl drinking it like it was holy water. He did not understand why Frank was being kind. They were the enemy. They had killed Jake. But as he turned to walk away, a thought crept in uninvited. She is the same age Jake was when he taught me to ride a horse. He pushed the thought away, buried it deep. But it was there now. And it would not stay buried forever. When she woke, the blanket was still there. That was the first surprise. It had not been taken in the night, had not been replaced with something thinner, rougher, less hers. She sat up slowly, muscles aching from the unfamiliar stillness of real sleep, the first uninterrupted sleep in months, maybe longer. The fabric still held the warmth of her body, and in that moment, the realization settled on her like morning frost. This blanket was hers. Not borrowed, not stolen, not temporary. It had been given to her. She clutched it like contraband, half expecting someone to yank it away and accuse her of theft. But no one came. No shouting, no punishment, just the sound of boots outside the barn and the far-off lowing of cattle. On a small crate beside her bed sat a tin basin with a cloth and a bar of soap. Folded next to it was a fresh pair of socks. She stared at them as though they were sacred relics. These were not just things, they were symbols of care, of worth, of being seen. Back home, she had learned not to expect anything permanent. Her shoes had belonged to her brother first. Her comb had cracked teeth. Her ration card had her name misspelled, and no one ever bothered to fix it. But here every item, every small, ordinary object carried the weight of something revolutionary. A toothbrush, a cup, a comb with all its teeth. They were unspoken declarations. You are worth the effort. That idea terrified her more than any weapon ever could. The next morning, Captain Thomas Mitchell sat behind his desk in the corner of the ranch house that had been converted into a command post. He was 45 years old, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts found in a war zone. Deep lines, weathered skin, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He had fought in the Great War, had stood in trenches filled with mud and blood and the screams of dying men, had watched friends get torn apart by artillery shells, had learned in those hellish months that the enemy was just another group of terrified boys following orders from old men who would never see a battlefield. He had a daughter back in San Antonio, 8 years old, who sent him drawings of horses every week. When Billy Walker knocked on his door that morning, Mitchell knew exactly why he had come. "Sir, I need to talk to you about my assignment." Mitchell did not look up from his papers. "Sit down, Walker." Billy remained standing. "Sir, with all respect, I volunteered to guard these prisoners, not to serve them." Now Mitchell looked up. His eyes were calm, patient, the eyes of a man who had learned that anger was a luxury soldiers could not afford. "You volunteered because your brother died at Pearl Harbor." "I know. Everyone knows. That's exactly why I'm giving you this assignment." Billy's jaw tightened. "Sir." Mitchell stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Texas sun was already turning the dirt to dust. "You need to see them, Walker, really see them, not as the enemy, as people, because if you can't do that, you're no use to me here. They killed my brother. The Japanese military killed your brother. The Japanese Empire killed your brother. These women did not. They were nurses, clerks, auxiliaries. Most of them were conscripted against their will. The girl who weighs 68 pounds was 13 years old when Pearl Harbor happened. 13. She was folding bandages in a field hospital while her own cities were being bombed to rubble." Billy said nothing. His hands were fisted at his sides. Mitchell turned to face him. "I fought in the Great War, Walker. I watched German boys die in the mud, calling for their mothers just like our boys did. And I learned something that took me years to understand. The enemy is not a nation. The enemy is not a flag. The enemy is war itself, and the only way to defeat it is to remember that the people on the other side are people." "With respect, sir, that sounds like something a politician would say." "Maybe, but it's also true." Mitchell sat back down. "You're assigned to morning duty. You will escort the prisoners to their work details. You will ensure they eat breakfast, and you will do it without complaint." Dismissed. Billy wanted to argue, wanted to walk out, wanted to tell this man that he did not understand, that no one understood, that the hatred burning in his chest was the only thing keeping him alive. But he could not refuse a direct order. "Yes, sir." He turned and walked out, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The next morning, Billy stood at the barn door with a tray of food in his hands. Eggs, bread, 2 strips of bacon. His fingers gripped the tray so tight they trembled. He did not want to be here, did not want to feed them. Every cell in his body screamed that this was wrong, that these people had taken Jake from him, had taken his mother, had destroyed everything. But orders were orders. He stepped inside. The other prisoners were already awake, sitting on their beds with their eyes cast down. But the smallest one, the girl who weighed 68 pounds, she was looking straight at him. Not with fear, not with defiance, just emptiness, like she was staring through him at something far beyond. He set the tray down in front of her. Eat. His voice came out colder than he intended, harder. She did not move. He stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do. Then he turned and walked away without looking back. In the ranch house kitchen, Frank Peterson was cooking. Bacon sizzled in a cast iron skillet. The sound filled the room. Pop, crackle, hiss, like a language all its own. The strips curled at the edges, turning from pink to gold, from gold to amber, from amber to perfect crisp. Fat rendered out, pooling in the pan like liquid treasure. The smell rose up and filled the kitchen and drifted out through the open window. Smoke, salt, pork, something faintly sweet from the maple cure. Frank flipped each strip methodically. Golden brown, crispy edges, exactly the way his father had taught him 50 years before. Billy delivered the tray to the barn. This time he stayed longer. Watched. Yuki stared at the bacon like it might bite her. It glistened in the morning light, edges curled like waves, fat still bubbling slightly. Back home, meat had become legend, spoken of but never seen. Her mother had once bought a single fish head from the black market and boiled it for 2 days to make broth. One fish head, for the whole family. The smell of this, of fat and fire and real meat, it was overwhelming. She raised the bacon to her mouth and hesitated. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the tray. Inside her head, the propaganda screamed, "Food from the enemy is poison. They want to weaken you. They want to make you trust them before they do what they really want to do." But her stomach did not care about propaganda. It growled, a wild, desperate sound she could not control. She bit down. The crunch echoed in her skull. Salt exploded on her tongue. Grease slid across her lips. The texture was crispy on the outside, but still had chew, still had substance. The flavor was so intense, so rich, so completely unlike anything she had ever tasted that her eyes went wide. Her throat tightened, not from disgust, from memory. Starving neighbors standing in line for rations that never came. Her mother's hollow cheeks growing more hollow each day. A child crying in the next room because the rice was gone and there was nothing to replace it. The bacon felt wrong. Too much, too rich, too real. Her eyes stung. She gagged. Billy, standing in the doorway, took a step forward, alarmed. But she waved him away and forced herself to swallow. Her body did not reject the food. Her mind did. But then she took another bite, because hunger does not ask permission. She ate in silence, chewing slowly, each bite an act of betrayal and survival at once. The bread was soft, the eggs were buttery, the bacon was still too much, but she finished it all. When she was done, she sat with empty hands staring at the tray. Inside her head, a question formed, uninvited, unstoppable. They said the Americans would starve us. They said the Americans would feed us rotten food. They lied. The thought felt dangerous, treasonous, like just thinking it could get her executed. But it would not go away. Billy stood in the doorway watching. He had expected aggression, ingratitude, maybe a fake thank you delivered through clenched teeth. He had not expected to see her cry while eating bacon. He had not expected to see her ribs move beneath the thin fabric as she swallowed. He had not expected to think she is starving. She is actually starving. What did they do to her? That night, for the first time since Jake died, Billy did not dream of the Arizona burning. He dreamed of a girl eating bacon like it was her last meal. He woke up angry at himself for caring, angry at her for making him care. But the anger could not quite reach the place where the image had settled. Deep, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. A week after her arrival, Frank Peterson handed Yuki a burlap sack filled with chicken feed and pointed toward the coop. She did not understand why. She was a prisoner, an enemy. Why would they trust her with anything alive? But he just smiled, half a smile more in his eyes than on his mouth, and pointed again. She followed. The coop was warm and smelled of straw feathers and faintly of eggs. The chickens clucked as she entered, their heads tilting toward her with curiosity rather than fear. She knelt, opened the sack, and scattered the feed. They rushed toward her in a feathered frenzy. At first she flinched, but they did not peck, did not bite. They simply ate, content in their routine. She sat back on her heels and watched. The rhythm of it was strange but soothing. It reminded her of the days before the firebombing when her mother kept two hens behind their house. She remembered the sound of her mother's voice calling them in the evening, the way she would gently tuck the eggs into her apron like treasure. The memories hurt, but not like before. This pain was duller, more like an echo than a scream. The chickens pecked and strutted around her, unconcerned with wars or ideologies. They did not care that she was Japanese, that she was a girl, that she was a prisoner. They simply accepted her. By the end of the week, Frank showed her how to collect eggs, then how to clean the coop. The work was never forced. He did not bark orders. He simply demonstrated, nodded, and left her to it. She discovered that the silence of the chicken coop, punctuated only by clucks and the soft rustle of wings, was easier to bear than the silence of the barn. It gave her hands something to do, her mind a place to rest. The cracks in her armor widened. Back home, kindness had been a strategy, a calculated display of loyalty to those above you. Here it was quieter, unannounced. A bar of soap, a bowl of stew, a task that implied trust. And that trust began to unmake her. One morning, Mrs. Ruth Nakamura, the oldest of the prisoners at 44, a nurse from Osaka who knew enough English to serve as translator, whispered the news like it was sacred. There will be a bath, hot water, real soap. Yuki's first reaction was not joy, it was suspicion. Hot water was something spoken of in past tense. Before the shortages, before the hospital had no heating, before the lice made even touching your own hair a kind of warfare. But when she followed the others to the far end of the barn, she saw them. Large galvanized tubs set up in a row, each filled with water warmed over a wood stove. Steam rising hypnotically in the cold morning air like incense in a temple. A wooden crate held folded towels, cloths, and bars of thick yellow soap. Coarse, square, impossibly fragrant. Yuki reached for one and stopped. Her fingers hovered over it like it might evaporate under her touch. She picked it up. It did not vanish. The scent hit her first. Lemon? Oh, something richer. She could not name it, but it made her dizzy. She sat at the edge of the tub, dipped a cloth into the water, and watched the soap lather into a froth of white bubbles. She had not seen lather in years, not real lather, not the kind that promised to strip away not just grime, but memory. One of the women sobbed quietly beside her, rubbing her arms over and over with the cloth as if she could erase the war from her skin. Another closed her eyes as she submerged her hair beneath the water and emerged gasping. Not from the heat, from something deeper. Resurrection. That was what it felt like. Yuki bathed slowly, carefully, each part of her body rediscovered beneath the suds. She had forgotten what it meant to feel clean. Not just not dirty, but clean. Her own scent returned, faint under the soap, familiar and startling. She ran the cloth over the backs of her ears, her neck, her arms. They were thinner than she remembered, but they were still hers. When the last of the tubs had gone cool, they dried themselves and dressed again in borrowed clothes. The towels were stiff, the fabric strange, but no one complained. For the first time, they looked at one another, not as shadows or statistics, but as women. Someone had managed to bring a tin of red lipstick. Smuggled, gifted. No one knew where it came from. It made its way down the line like contraband passed from hand to hand. Yuki did not use it, but she held it. That alone was enough. A color from a world she had forgotten. Then came the sound of boots outside the barn. Cowboys, two of them leaning against the doorframe, peeking in. Not leering, not laughing at them, just curious. One tipped his hat and said something in English, too fast to understand. Then he lifted a ridiculous, oversized saloon-style hat off his head, placed it on the other cowboy, and both of them burst into laughter. The sound was honest, harmless. It did not pierce like gunfire. It filled the barn with something disarming. Some of the women chuckled. Quiet at first, then louder. Not one of them had heard that sound in months. The cowboys walked off, still laughing, never glancing back. No threat. Just two young men playing with time in a world no longer at war. Yuki looked at the leftover soap in her palm. It was melting now, soft around the edges. But it had not disappeared. Neither had she. One evening, a fire was lit just beyond the barn. Its glow stretched long fingers across the dirt as dusk settled over the ranch. The air cooled quickly, carrying with it the smell of smoke and dry grass. Yuki sat with the other women in a loose circle blankets, wrapped tight around their shoulders. The fire crackled steady and alive, and for once no one was counting minutes or watching shadows. The cowboys sat a short distance away, not crowding them, not guarding them. just sharing the same night. One of the younger men shuffled a deck of cards, the worn edges whispering against each other. He crouched near Yuki and held up a card, speaking slowly. "This is King." He tapped the face, then handed it to her. She stared at it, uncertain, then nodded. "Another card, Queen." She repeated the word softly, testing it on her tongue. "Queen." The game unfolded clumsily. Rules explained through gestures and broken phrases. But it did not matter. Winning was not the point. Sitting together was. At some point, someone produced a harmonica. Small, scratched, clearly loved. The cowboy held it out to Yuki without ceremony. She hesitated. Instruments back home had been reserved for ceremonies, for controlled moments. This felt informal, dangerous. But she took it. Her fingers wrapped around the cool metal. She brought it to her lips and blew. The sound that came out was sharp and wrong. The group burst into laughter, not mocking, just surprised. She tried again, another sour note, more laughter. And then without warning, she laughed too. It escaped her before she could stop it. Light and startled as if it did not belong to her. The sound hung in the air for a moment, fragile and unreal. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide. The others stared. Then one of the women laughed as well. Then another. The firelight danced across their faces as the sound grew. Shaky at first, then stronger. Yuki's chest tightened. Guilt surged in fast and hot. How could she laugh when her mother might still be hungry, when her brother was likely dead, when cities lay in ash across the ocean? The laugh caught in her throat and died away. But the cowboys did not stop smiling. They did not hush her. No one punished joy. That was when the question rose, uninvited and unstoppable. If the enemy valued her life enough to teach her a game, to hand her music, to laugh with her, instead of at her, why had her own country treated her as disposable? The thought felt dangerous, treasonous, but it would not leave. She looked around the circle. These women had been told the same thing she had, that they were tools, that suffering was proof of loyalty, that death was preferable to capture. And yet here they sat, fed, warm, learning words in another language, laughing by a fire lit by men they had been trained to hate. One of the older women spoke softly in Japanese, almost to herself. "They see us." No one argued. Yuki met the eyes of a cowboy across the fire. He did not look away. There was no triumph in his gaze, no hunger, just recognition, as if he were seeing a person, not a uniform. She lowered her eyes first, her heart pounding. That simple exchange unsettled her more than any shouted command ever had. The harmonica made its way back around the circle this time, producing something closer to a tune. Someone clapped. Someone else hummed. The fire popped and shifted. For a brief stretch of time, the war loosened its grip. But the reckoning lingered. If dignity could be offered so easily by strangers, what had been stolen from them by those who claimed to protect them? Yuki pulled her blanket tighter and stared into the flames. The fire did not judge, it just burned. She did not know the answer yet. She only knew that once the question had been asked, it could never be unasked. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning. A military jeep pulled up to the ranch carrying mail reports and newspapers. Captain Mitchell read them in his office. His face grew darker with each line. The reports detailed what the Japanese military had done in Manila, in the Philippines, in prisoner of war camps across the Pacific, Bataan Death March. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers forced to march 65 miles in brutal heat. Those who fell were bayoneted. Those who asked for water were shot. Manila Massacre. Over 100,000 civilians killed in a single month. Women and children. Hospitals and churches. No one was spared. And the POW camps. American soldiers starved to the point of death. Tortured for information they did not have. Executed for sport. The photographs were worse than the words. Skeletal bodies. Mass graves and aims. The hollow eyes of men who had been broken in ways that could never be repaired. Some of the cowboys saw the newspapers. The pictures passed from hand to hand. The mood on the ranch shifted overnight. Some men refused to speak to the prisoners. Others looked at them with something new. Not curiosity, rage, a hatred that had been sleeping and was now very much awake. When Billy saw the photographs, his hands trembled. Jake could have been like this if he had survived Pearl Harbor, if he had been captured instead of killed. They could have done this to him. He did not speak for the rest of the day, but that night he volunteered for guard duty. No one asked why. Around 2 in the morning, the barn door creaked open. Billy stepped inside. He had been drinking. Not drunk, just enough to loosen what he usually kept locked tight. Yuki woke at the sound of boots. She sat up, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Billy stood at the foot of her bed looking down. Moonlight from a crack in the door fell across his face, and she saw something she had never seen before. Not coldness, pain, raw living pain. You know what they did in Manila? Yuki did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She pulled the blanket tighter. They starved our boys, tortured them, killed them for sport. Silence. The other prisoners had woken, holding their breath in the darkness. And I'm supposed to bring you bacon, feed you breakfast while they... His voice cracked. My brother died because of your people. My mother died because she couldn't live without him, and you get to sit here laughing by the fire like nothing happened. Yuki did not understand most of what he said, but she understood brother, understood died. She looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving, she spoke. Just one word, in Japanese, trembling. Otuto, younger brother. Silence, heavy and long. Mrs. Nakamura spoke softly from her corner. She had a younger brother, Kenji. He died, a soldier. She does not know where. Billy stared at Yuki. She stared back. Two people who had lost brothers to the same war, standing on opposite sides of a line that suddenly seemed less like a wall and more like a mirror. How old was he? 17. Same age when he left. Jake had been 22 when he died, but he had been 17 once too, full of dreams and stupid jokes and a future he would never see. The barn door opened. Frank Peterson stood there, moonlight behind him like a halo. Billy, go away, Frank. I will not. You think Jake would want this? You think your mother raised you to yell at starving girls in the middle of the night? Silence, long and heavy. I knew your brother. He was a good man, best I ever met. And I know that if Jake were standing here right now, he would not be holding a whiskey bottle and scaring children. He would be asking how he could help. Billy wanted to argue, wanted to scream that Frank did not understand. But when he turned back to Yuki, he saw that she was crying, not making a sound, just tears streaming down her cheeks, silent as rain on a window. She was not crying because she was scared. She was crying because she understood. She had lost someone too. Billy's hand went slack. The tension drained from his shoulders. I'm sorry. He turned and walked into the night. But he did not go far. He just sat on the barn porch, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. That night, something cracked in Billy Walker that had been building for 4 years. He did not become kind overnight. He did not forgive the Japanese Empire or forget what they had done. But he began to see that the enemy and a 15-year-old girl were not the same thing. And that was the first step towards something he did not have a name for yet. 2 weeks passed after the night in the barn. 2 weeks of silence that slowly softened into something else. Billy Walker no longer avoided the barn. He was not friendly. No one expected that. But he stopped looking at the prisoners like he wanted them to disappear. Sometimes when he passed by, he would nod. Just a small movement of his head, barely noticeable. But Yuki noticed. She did not understand the change completely, but she felt it. The absence of threat where threat had lived before. The loosening of something that had been tight as a fist. The ranch settled into a rhythm. Morning chores, meals, work details, evening fires that no longer felt dangerous. The war was over, and slowly, imperceptibly, the people on this small piece of Texas earth were learning how to live in a world without it. One morning while Yuki was folding freshly washed cloths by the water pump, a man in uniform approached her. Not a cowboy, a sergeant. His boots were polished to a shine, his expression unreadable behind the lines carved into his face like dry riverbeds. In his hand he held something small. He did not speak at first, just extended the object. It was a yellow pencil, short, dull at the tip, with a scrap of paper folded beneath it. Write home, he said softly. Then he turned and walked away. Yuki stood motionless. The pencil in her fingers felt like it might burst into flames. Write home. Was this a test? A trap? No one had said this was allowed. The last letter she had received from her mother had been scribbled on rice paper delivered through military channels censored into near nonsense. Half the words had been blacked out. The other half made no sense without context. Now she was being handed a chance to write back. She stared at the paper like it was a map she could not read. Her thumb brushed the grain of the fibers, the soft edge of the pencil wood. What could I possibly say? That I am alive. That the Americans, the enemies, the devils, the monsters and propaganda posters have given me eggs and bacon. A toothbrush. A blanket. Would her mother even believe it? The blank space in front of her felt like betrayal. Every line she might write seemed like a confession. I am here. I am not dead. I am not being tortured. I am warm. Every truth was a contradiction. She sat on a wooden crate outside the barn, pencil hovering above the page. She wanted to write her mother's name, but her hand would not move. Back home, she had been taught that silence was patriotism, that words were dangerous unless they served the emperor. That communication could betray the state, the family, the self. To write to her mother now would be to admit that her world had already crumbled, that her commanders had been wrong. That surrender was not death, but something stranger, a life she did not understand. The sun slipped lower in the sky, casting long orange shadows across the dirt. The banjo played again somewhere in the distance, soft and meandering. Finally, Yuki lowered the pencil to the paper. Her handwriting was stiff, clumsy, her fingers out of practice. She began a sentence, scratched it out, started another, stopped halfway. Then at last she wrote 2 words. Watashi wa enzen desu. I am safe. That was all. No name, no address, no explanation, just 2 words. Because that was the most radical truth she could offer. She folded the paper, walked to the sergeant's office, and placed it on his desk without a word. He looked up, nodded once, reached for an envelope. When she stepped outside, something had changed. She realized slowly, deeply, that she no longer expected the bomb sirens. She had not imagined a guard's boot in over a week. Her jaw, usually clenched in sleep, had begun to loosen. The war for her was no longer in the present tense. It was a memory, a shadow, still loud, still close, but behind her. And in its place, a whisper of something new. Not trust, not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of belief that this strange land with its pencils and pork and plucking strings was not hell. It might not be home, but it was no longer the battlefield. One afternoon, while walking past the ranch house, Yuki heard the slam of a screen door. A small girl came bounding down the steps, maybe 8 or 9 years old, her braid flying behind her, her eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. This was Sarah Mitchell, the captain's daughter visiting from San Antonio. In her hand, she held something small, a thin piece of fabric, pink, bright, alive. A ribbon. She ran up to Yuki without hesitation, as if enemy and potential friend had no difference in her mind, as if the war had never taught her to hate. For you, she said in English, grinning wide. Then she skipped off toward the paddock, never looking back. Yuki held the ribbon like it was gold. Wear it. Keep it hidden. What did it mean to accept something that had once been unthinkable? That evening, she tied it into her hair, just above her ear, neat and small. The reaction was immediate. Some of the women gasped. A few turned away. One whispered that it was shameful. But no one said it to her face. They could not, because they had watched her change. Slowly, quietly, openly. The ribbon was more than decoration. It was defiance, not against Japan, but against what Japan had told her to be. Against the idea that she was only a function, a servant to war, a body to be used and discarded. She looked into the small mirror and saw not a soldier, not a burden, not a tool, but a girl. The next morning, Billy was walking past when he saw her, and the pink ribbon in her hair. He stopped. For a moment, he saw something different. Not the enemy, not the Japanese, just a girl, young, thin, with a pink ribbon in her hair like any child in any small town in Texas. He tipped his hat, no comment, no mockery, just a nod of recognition. She nodded back and kept walking, because she was not performing, she was not pretending. She was becoming, slowly, day by day, reclaiming her own shape. A week later, Billy came to find Yuki while she was feeding the chickens. He stood at the door of the coop, hesitant. His hands turned his hat around and around. Then he held something out. It was a piece of chocolate, small, wrapped in foil, slightly melted from the heat of his pocket. For your mother. He said the words awkward, each one like he was learning a new language. When you go home, tell her a Texas cowboy wanted her to have it. Yuki looked at the chocolate, then at Billy. She did not understand all of his words, but she understood the gesture. This small rectangle represented so much. American abundance, American generosity, an enemy caring about another enemy's starving mother. She took it with trembling hands. The wrapper was still warm from his pocket. Thank you. It was the first English sentence she had spoken to him. 2 words. Simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had changed. Billy nodded. His eyes were wet, but he did not turn away. Your brother, Kenji. He sounds like a good kid. Mrs. Nakamura translated from nearby. Yuki listened, and for the first time she smiled at him. Just a little, but real. Your brother, Jake. Good man, yes. Billy swallowed hard. It took him a moment to answer. Yeah, he was the best. Then you good man too. It was not forgiveness. They both knew that. But it was something, an acknowledgement, a fragile bridge across the chasm of war. And sometimes that was all that could exist. The notice came on a November morning, pinned to the board outside the mess hall in plain English and careful Japanese. Repatriation. The word looked unreal, like it belonged to another life. Yuki stood before it, hands folded, reading it again and again until the letters settled into meaning. She would be going home, not back to the girl she had been, not back to the world that had burned and starved her, but back to a country changed beyond recognition. And she would not be the same either. On the morning of departure, Doc Henderson weighed her one last time. He checked the scale twice, then smiled to himself. 102 pounds. He wrote the number down neatly as if recording a quiet victory. 34 pounds, Miss Tanaka. You gained 34 pounds. When she had arrived, she had weighed 68. The number had been a shock, a fact too stark to argue with. Now the difference showed everywhere. In her cheeks, which had filled out, in the steadiness of her walk, in the way she met people's eyes without flinching. The war had not been kind to her body, but it had not taken everything. Doc Henderson reached into his bag and pulled out something else. A pair of glasses, fitted carefully after she had admitted she had not seen clearly in years. She put them on. The world sharpened instantly. Edges appeared where there had only been blur. Faces became distinct. Colors brightened. She blinked, overwhelmed by the clarity. No one should have to live in a blur, Doc Henderson said gently. She nodded, understanding more than the language allowed. In her small bundle, she packed the things that had become hers. The diary filled with uneven handwriting, pages of thoughts she had never been able to speak aloud. The ribbon, now faded from sun and washing, but still hers. The pencil, worn almost to nothing. The chocolate from Billy, still intact, save for her mother. And folded carefully into the inside pocket of her new coat, a letter. From a cowboy, written in awkward, careful words. You're tougher than you look. Good luck, kid. She boarded the truck with the others as the sun crested the horizon. The ranch stood quiet behind them, fences stretching out into the distance, cattle lowing softly in the morning mist, as if unaware that anything was ending. The cowboys lined up near the gate, no speeches, no military salutes, just hats tipped low, one by one. Frank Peterson stepped forward. He extended his hand. Yuki hesitated, then placed her hand in his. You take care of yourself, little one, and remember, war ends. People don't have to. She did not understand every word, but she understood enough. Thank you for stew. Frank laughed. His eyes were wet. Anytime, kid, anytime. Billy stood at the end of the line. When Yuki walked past, he did not speak at first, just stood there turning his hat in his hands. Then just as she was about to climb into the truck, he spoke. Hey, she turned. Your brother, Kenji, he would be proud of you. Yuki looked at him. He looked back. Two people who had lost brothers to the same war, standing on opposite sides of a line that had become something else entirely. Not a wall, not a mirror, something new. Your brother, Jake. Good man, yes. Billy swallowed. His eyes stung. Yeah, he was. Then you good man too. She climbed into the truck. She did not look back. Not because she did not want to, but because if she looked back, she might not have the strength to leave. The truck pulled away, kicking up red dust in its wake. The ranch grew smaller in the distance. Fences, cattle, hay bales, men in hats, until it was just a smudge on the horizon, until it disappeared entirely. Yuki sat in the back of the truck, clutching her bundle, watching Texas vanish. She had arrived weighing 68 pounds, barely more than a shadow. She left weighing 102, carrying something far heavier than flesh. She carried the knowledge that even in war, humanity could survive. When the ship docked, the port was scarred and subdued. Buildings leaned like tired men. Faces were thin. The air carried the weight of loss. Japan, 1946, a nation defeated, a people broken, an empire reduced to rubble and silence. Yuki stepped onto Japanese soil and felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She touched the ribbon in her hair, the diary in her coat. These things anchored her. They reminded her that dignity was not something a nation could grant or take away. She blended into their crowd, another survivor among many, carrying no banner, no answers, only memory. She would never forget the ranch, the barn that was warm, the banjo strings in the night, the bacon she had gagged on and eaten anyway, the pencil, the soap, the laughter that had felt like rebellion. She had arrived at the ranch as a ghost. She left as a girl learning to become a woman. 2 years later, Yuki found her mother. Sachiko Tanaka was still alive, living in a small room on the outskirts of Nagoya, older, thinner, her eyes carrying a distance that had not been there before. When Yuki walked through the door, her mother did not recognize her at first. Yuki, the name came out like a whisper. Like speaking it might make her disappear. I am home, mother. I am safe. They held each other in that small room. Two women who had survived the war, learning how to be family again. And on the table between them sat a piece of chocolate, slightly melted, still wrapped in foil. A cowboy in Texas wanted you to have this, Yuki said. Her mother unwrapped it slowly, took a bite, and for the first time in years she smiled. It is the sweetest thing I have ever tasted. In 1952, Yuki opened a small school in her village. She taught English, the words she had learned at Walker Ranch. King, queen, thank you, good man. Her students were the children of war, orphans, abandoned, looking for a future in the rubble. She taught them more than words. She taught them that the world was larger than their borders, that enemies could become friends, that a ribbon and a chocolate bar could change a life. In 1965, a letter arrived from Texas. The handwriting was shaky, the words simple. Dear Miss Tanaka, I do not know if you remember me. I was one of the guards at Walker Ranch, the angry one. I wanted to write sooner but did not know what to say. Still do not really, but I got married last year, had a son, named him Jacob after my brother. My wife asked me once what changed me. I told her about a Japanese girl who weighed 68 pounds and taught me that enemies are just people you have not shared a meal with yet. I hope you are well. I hope your mother got to taste that chocolate. Sincerely, Billy Walker. Yuki read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down and wrote back. Dear Mr. Walker, I remember you, the angry cowboy who brought me bacon. I became a teacher. I have students who remind me of the chickens at your ranch. Curious, hungry, unafraid. My mother passed last year, but before she died, she ate the chocolate. She said it was the sweetest thing she ever tasted. Thank you for writing. Thank you for remembering. Sincerely, Yuki Tanaka. In 1985, Walker Ranch hosted a reunion. Survivors from the POW camp, their families, the cowboys who had guarded them, now old men with grandchildren of their own. Yuki could not attend. Her health would not allow a journey so far. But she sent something instead. The pink ribbon. Faded now. Almost white, but still intact. Attached was a note. This ribbon was given to me by a child. It reminded me that I was still human. Please hang it somewhere people can see. Let it remind them that small kindnesses can save lives. They hung it in the Walker Ranch Historical Museum, next to a black and white photograph of a girl who weighed 68 pounds. The girl in the photograph was skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely alive. The ribbon beside her was proof that she had become something more. Below them in careful calligraphy were 2 words. Watashi wa anzen desu. I am safe. 75 years after the war ended, a young woman walked into the Walker Ranch Historical Museum in Texas. She had dark hair and quiet eyes. Her name was Sarah Tanaka Williams, Yuki's great-granddaughter. She stood in front of the glass case where a faded pink ribbon lay next to a black and white photograph. The photograph showed a girl her own age, a girl who had been told she would be devoured by monsters, a girl who had found something else entirely. Sarah stood there for a long time, reading the plaques, looking at the artifacts, trying to understand a world she had only heard about in stories. Outside the museum, Texas stretched endless and golden under the afternoon sun. Cattle grazed in distant fields. Somewhere faint and joyful, a banjo was playing. The ribbon in the display case had faded almost to white, but it had not disappeared. Neither had she. Neither had any of them, because this is what it means to be human. Not the fighting, not the victory, but the moment when you look at your enemy and choose to see a person. The moment when you break bread with someone you were taught to hate. The moment when you realize that breakfast can change the world. Yuki Tanaka arrived at Walker Ranch weighing 68 pounds and expecting to die. She left weighing 102 pounds and carrying the knowledge that mercy was not weakness, that kindness was not surrender, that the distance between enemy and friend was nothing more than a bowl of stew and a willingness to see. She spent the rest of her life teaching that lesson to her students, to her children, to anyone who would listen. And now, 75 years later, her great-granddaughter stood in a Texas museum looking at a faded ribbon and understanding. War ends, but people do not have to. Small kindnesses can save lives. And sometimes a pink ribbon and a piece of chocolate are enough to change the world. That is the story of Yuki Tanaka, A girl who weighed 68 pounds and learned that humanity can survive even the darkest chapters of history. If this story has moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history that the world nearly forgot.